The first video covered defining and describing natural resource management, so we're going to move on to talk about some constraints associated with natural resource management. I like to think about the constraints on natural resource management as a triangle. All three of these types of constraints are important, and all of them help to determine basically what is possible. So when I'm talking about constraints, I'm talking about things that sort of define the envelope where we operate. There's some things we just can't do because there are constraints to prevent us from doing certain things. And the categories of those constraints are biophysical, economic, and regulatory and societal. Biophysical are like the name sounds, both biological, ooh, yellow, that won't work. They're both biological and physical. So let's think of some examples of those. So, biological has to do with the biology. So for instance, in forestry, we're managing trees and forests. If we had, for instance, an objective in northern Florida to manage Sitka spruce for violin production or guitar production, that's not possible because Sitka spruce does not grow in northern Florida. That's just a biological constraint. We might have management objectives that are not possible because, for instance, the soils in a particular place don't allow a particular growth rate, for instance, due to nutrient limitations. So that's a biological constraint. So things having to do with biology or ecology are typically biological constraints. Physical constraints are usually things related to, for instance, climate. So the climate is going to limit our ability to do particular natural resource management activities. Now, the climate is changing all over the globe, so those physical constraints are likely to evolve and change in any particular location. And that's one of the big challenges of natural resource management right now, is that some of those physical or climate constraints in any particular place are changing. Regulatory and societal, these are constraints associated with regulations or laws. It may just not be legal to do particular natural resource management activities in particular places. Examples of regulatory constraints are best management practices, or BMPs. We have best management practices, usually related to water quality in forestry or preservation of water quality. Which constrain what kind of management we should be doing in a particular place. So, for instance, we can't put a log deck in an ephemeral stream bed. That's against best management practices. We can't clear cut down to the banks of a perennial stream, because that's a special management zone, and BMPs in Florida, for instance, prevent us from doing that. So that's an example of regulatory constraints. Those are laws or regulation that prevent us doing particular things. Societal, I'm meaning that to be more broadly. There may be things that, for instance, may even be legal, but that really we should not be doing, or that society might prevent us from doing. So in particular places, for instance, Europe, uh, actually in Europe, some of these are regulatory, but in many places there are large societal pushback to use of transgenic organisms that have had genes introduced to them from different species. Uh, in the United States, there are societal resistance to use of some transgenic organisms, even though we use them, for instance, in agriculture. So those are examples of societal constraints. And then economic constraints, obviously, are constraints having to do with dollars. And those constraints are also very important. Now, thinking about economic constraints for for-profit organizations like a timber company are pretty straightforward. Clearly, a timber company, a corporate land manager, has their management is driven by economics. They exist to turn a profit. So in that way, it can be tempting to think about, for instance, public landowners as not having economic constraints because they typically are not driven by a profit mandate. But even nonprofit or government landowners or non-government nonprofit landowners still have economic constraints. They, for instance, don't have unlimited budgets to achieve particular management goals. So essentially all landowners have economic constraints because their budgets are not unlimited. Sometimes to broaden our thinking about economics, it can be helpful to expand beyond, the dollar sign idea. Certainly, usually when we do economic calculations, for instance, even for non-dollar benefits, we often have to express those in terms of dollars and find a way of doing that because that's sort of how economic analysis is based. But more broadly, economics is really about the efficient production of benefits. And then analyzing trade-offs associated with management and the production of benefits. So economic frameworks allow us to analyze trade-offs and make decisions about different management alternatives, for instance. There are many kinds of economic constraints, and earlier I mentioned sort of the obvious one that regardless of whether you're a public or private landowner, you never have an unlimited budget. Okay, so that is an obvious economic constraint. Some economic constraints are less obvious. So for instance, in forestry, there are economies, well, in many things there are economies of scale, but certainly in forestry there are economies of scale. That has a very real implication when we think about, for instance, the size of tract that we manage, especially with regard to treatments or harvests. So for instance, we may have a piece of property where there's a little 5-acre piece where we would like to do a treatment or like a thinning, an application of herbicide, or some other treatment. But generally, those very small tract sizes, like 5 acres, are often too small for us to get a contractor to come in to do a harvest or to do a treatment. So in forestry, economies of scale are important because usually it's difficult to do a treatment or to do a harvest on any tract smaller than, sort of rule of thumb, is probably 40 or 50 acres. We usually are going to have to apply a treatment on that size or larger of a tract to be able to have a contractor come in and sort of meet their fixed costs of setting up in order to do that treatment. So that's another example of an economic constraint. Another economic constraint that may not be immediately obvious is that the time value of money is important. So when we're making natural resource management decisions, we're often thinking about things that will occur far into the future. And because of the time value of money, costs that are far into the future basically have less of an impact because they're into the future. Similarly, benefits, like for instance a timber harvest, that are far into the future have a relatively smaller benefit because they're in the future. So dollars that we spend in the future cost us less in economic cost, but benefits or revenues that are further into the future have a smaller revenue. So basically, when we're doing economic analysis, we adjust everything to the present. So benefits in the future are smaller, costs in the future are smaller. Similarly, harvest, for instance, benefits that we are able to do more sooner have a greater benefit, and costs that happen now are larger. You'll take courses in economics that'll sort of delve into this and help you to understand that better, but it's sort of inherent in natural resource management that we need to think about the time value of money, because we're almost always dealing with multi-decadal timescales when we're making our decisions, and that can influence whether, for instance, we do something now or 10 years into the future, because those relative costs and benefits differ based on time as well. Sustainability is another term that will have probably as many definitions as people that you can ask about it. So, and it has become a bit of a controversial term, partially because it's been misused a lot. But I'll say that in natural resource management, and especially in forestry, we still use the word sustainability, and it has a meaning. Again, it may be controversial in some circles, but I think it still has utility. And my definition of sustainability is managing a resource in such a way as to provide goods or services or benefits, whatever you're managing for, indefinitely. And that's one of the important parts of the definition, is that you can provide those benefits forever. That's what indefinitely means, obviously. So this implies that the ability of the resource to provide those benefits is protected or even enhanced by the management. Okay, so really, this is sort of the ultimate goal of renewable natural resource management, is that we are shooting for sustainability. If we wanted to, for instance, produce clean water from a forest and we're managing it in that way, our intent is to do that forever, to manage it in a way that that ecosystem will continue producing clean water in perpetuity. And in order to do that, we need to protect the ability of that ecosystem to provide that benefit, or even enhance it to make it better. And often we can manage that resource in a way that, for instance, more clean water is produced in the future than before we started managing it. And that's one of the great things about sustainable natural resource management, is that sometimes we can enhance the ability of that resource to produce that benefit. Now, sustainability usually is defined not just in terms of dollar signs. It usually is defined in terms of different elements, and there are 3 elements that often turn up in terms of sustainability. So those are ecological, societal, and economic. Do those sound familiar? Those were the 3 constraints on natural resource management, right? Well, these are sometimes called the pillars of sustainability. So if we're going to say that, for instance, the management we're doing in a particular ecosystem is sustainable, it needs to be sustainable both in terms of ecological sustainability, so the ability of that ecosystem has to ecologically be able to produce that benefit in perpetuity. But it needs to be sustainable in terms of society. Will society be in favor of that management forever? Are the laws and regulations supportive of that? Are the people in that society supportive of that management in perpetuity? And then, is that management economically sustainable? Maybe you're doing management actions that enhance or protect the provision of that benefit, but you can't afford to continue doing that forever. So is it economically sustainable? So all 3 of those things need to be in place in reality for a particular management to be truly sustainable. When we do natural resource management, we don't just walk into the ecosystem and start doing things. And I think that's probably pretty obvious, but just to reiterate, this involves planning. So let's go over the steps of the natural resource planning process. Now, obviously, every situation will be different, and not every situation will follow this exact sequence, but this is a nice general outline of steps involved in natural resource management planning. This is from a textbook on natural resource management planning by Pete Bettinger and colleagues. And these are 9 steps here. The first is to allow public participation and comment on the goals or objectives for the area. So think about that. Do you think this applies equally to public and private land ownership? No. This is really primarily involved in public land management. In fact, for many entities, regulations or statute require public participation in determining the goals and objectives for a particular piece of property. And that makes sense, right? The public owns those public resources, and so allowing or having mechanisms for the public to comment on that makes sense. Private land ownership, this is generally or usually not done for private ownership. Now, there's nothing stopping a private landowner from asking their neighbors what they think. There may be, high-profile private landowners that are want to make sure their customers or stakeholders are okay with what they're doing. So there may be situations where private landowners check in with the public or some segment of the public, but generally it's not required and it's often not done. But determining the goals is always necessary. We have to know what the goal is for a particular piece of property in order to have a management plan. We need to know what the endpoint is. And then the next step usually involves saying, what do we have? Okay, and that usually involves doing an inventory. What do we have? And what condition is it in? Okay, so that usually involves an inventory, a measurement of what we have. That tells us our starting point. This is what's there now. Our goal is to get to a particular place. How do we do that? A lot of your training in your degree will be learning the tools that you can use to move a piece of property from current conditions to desired future conditions specified by those goals. And in doing that, you will formulate management alternatives. You say, okay, this is our goal. We could do this series of management actions, or we could do this other series of management actions to reach those goals. And you would need to assess those alternatives, look at those alternatives to determine which one is best. You may do that in conversation with the landowner, or you as a manager might do that assessment. And there are many different things you think about when you're assessing management alternatives. Often that involves economic analysis, but it may involve other types of analysis, modeling of different sorts, applying your professional judgment, thinking about the time that it might require for one alternative versus another. All of those things go into that. But in the end, you in conjunction with the landowner will select an alternative and then create a detailed plan for how that management gets carried out. And then that management plan gets implemented. The landowner is ultimately responsible for implementing or carrying out that management plan. And sometimes the natural resource manager who wrote the plan isn't involved in implementation. So you might write that management plan, but then you give that to the landowner and it's up to them to implement. Sometimes, for instance, as a consultant, you might also be involved in implementing the management plan as well, hiring contractors, carrying out management actions. So it will depend on the situation whether the manager is involved in that implementation or not. And then monitoring the management plan. This basically means checking to determine whether we're moving in the right direction. Are we achieving our goals? This is another thing that's really important in natural resource management because, again, we're usually dealing with multi-decade decisions and actions. And it's impossible to know that what we've prescribed in a management plan whether it will actually achieve those goals. So we need to check, and that monitoring is important. If in that monitoring we determine that we're not moving towards our goals, then we change or update the management plan. That's super important. Those changes in the management plan, those adjustments here, if we find we're not on track, are important. And this sequence of events, planning, implementing or doing, evaluating or monitoring, and then that adjustment, that's all. That cycle is called adaptive management. Adaptive management is important because, one, we have imperfect information about ecosystems. We don't know all of the pieces and how they respond to management. It's just too complicated, and we don't have sufficient resources to know everything. There are long time spans involved, and things change. We're in a changing climate. The regulatory environment might change. Societal or economic environment might change. Markets might change. Many things might change. So because of that, we need to be able to adjust on the fly. And adaptive management is the framework that allows us to do that. So we can never sort of just rely on a cookbook or recipe for how to do things. We need to use the best knowledge that we have to write a management plan, but then we need to be able to monitor and make adjustments over time to that management plan to ensure that we achieve our objectives.